The gray sky hung low over the Pocono Mountains, the kind of heavy autumn sky that pressed on a man's chest and made every breath feel like labor. Rob Mitchell stood among the rows of weathered gravestones, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. In front of him lay the polished granite marker that bore the names of his wife and his son. Fresh flowers had wilted in the vase, their petals darkened by the morning rain. He crouched slowly, brushing a few dead leaves away with a trembling hand. His face was pale, and his eyes carried that hollowed-out look of someone who had been staring into emptiness too long. 3 years had passed, yet the image of that night still clung to him like a second skin. A truck had come barreling through an intersection on Route 209, its driver drunk, its brakes useless. Rob had been a step behind, delayed by a call from the precinct. His wife and little boy never made it home. Their car was crushed against the guardrail, metal bent like paper. He remembered the sirens, the flashing lights, and the voices of the paramedics that turned quieter when they saw him. The driver, the man who had shattered his life, had walked out of the courthouse free. A suspended sentence. Money had changed hands. Favors had been called in. That was the day Rob Mitchell, once a respected investigator with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, stopped believing in justice. He resigned within a week, turning in his badge and gun. The law, he told himself, wasn't built for people like him, or for the dead he buried. Rob stayed crouched at the grave, whispering words that no one else would hear. "I'm sorry. I should have been there." His voice cracked, and the wind carried it away. He touched the carved names, his thumb tracing the letters as though memorizing them all over again. Then he stood, shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. The cemetery was empty except for a few crows perched on the iron fence. Their cries followed him as he walked down the gravel path. The world around him blurred into muted colors. The wet grass, the pale stones, the sky sinking into dusk. Every step seemed heavier than the last. By the time he reached the road, his chest felt tight, the air thick. He drove aimlessly, his truck winding through the mountain roads. He wasn't heading home. Home was just a cabin filled with silence, a fridge with little more than beer and leftovers, and a chair by the window where he sat most nights, staring at nothing. Tonight, the emptiness had grown unbearable. He found himself at the old steel bridge that crossed the Delaware River, a place where the mountains dipped low and the water ran fast. He parked on the shoulder and stepped out, the chill wind biting through his clothes. The river churned below, dark and endless, pulling at the rocks with a force that promised oblivion. Rob walked to the middle of the bridge, his boots echoing on the metal grating. He leaned on the railing, staring down into the black water. His fingers tightened around the cold steel as thoughts he had buried for months clawed their way to the surface. What was left for him? His family was gone. His work had betrayed him. Every day was just another repetition of grief. He thought about how quick it would be, just one step, the fall, the silence, and then nothing. Maybe then he would see his wife and son again. The wind howled in his ears, carrying the scent of wet leaves and river moss. He closed his eyes. For a long moment, he just listened to the current, to the hollow beat of his own heart, to the whisper that told him no one would miss him if he let go. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing tighter. The memory of his son's laughter rose in his mind, sharp as glass. The way the boy used to run across the yard with his toy airplane, shouting that he'd fly higher than the clouds. Rob's chest ached, and his breath caught in a ragged sob. He pulled back from the edge, pressing his palms to his face. He wasn't ready. Not tonight. But the darkness followed him, step for step, as he turned away from the river. He staggered back to his truck, slammed the door shut, and sat there in silence with the engine off, the sound of the rushing water still echoing in his ears. The bridge had not taken him, but the thought lingered, pressing close, promising release. Somewhere inside, a faint, stubborn ember of survival remained, though he couldn't name why. For Rob Mitchell, life had narrowed into a corridor of grief, and tonight was only the beginning of a story he never expected to live. The night grew colder as Rob steered his truck along the winding road that hugged the edge of the Pocono forest. The storm had passed hours earlier, but the air still carried the smell of wet pine and earth. He wasn't sure why he was driving there, maybe just to get away from the silence of the cabin, maybe to outrun the thoughts that had nearly pushed him off the bridge. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was debris washed down from the storm. A dark shape at the edge of the embankment, half hidden by brush. He slowed, headlights sweeping across the roadside, and his chest tightened when he realized it wasn't debris at all. A young woman lay sprawled on the ground, motionless, her pale face framed by damp hair. Beside her sat a large dog, its coat matted, its eyes burning with fierce loyalty. The animal growled low when Rob pulled over, but didn't move away from her side. Rob stepped out slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm not here to hurt her." The dog stayed alert, tail stiff but didn't lunge. Its protective stance was enough to make Rob's throat tighten. He knew devotion when he saw it. He crouched beside the woman, gently touching her wrist, a pulse weak but there. Her skin was clammy and her breathing shallow. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe younger, with the kind of delicate features that suggested she had once lived a very different life than this. Her clothes were damp and torn, her shoes muddy from miles of walking. Rob glanced around the empty road. Out here, no ambulance would come fast enough. He couldn't carry her alone, not with the dog guarding her every movement. He straightened, waving down the single pair of headlights approaching from the curve. A beat-up delivery truck rattled to a stop, the driver rolling down his window with suspicion written on his face. "What's going on?" the man asked. Rob explained quickly, keeping it simple. A girl unconscious, needed to get her somewhere safe. The driver hesitated, then climbed out to help. Between the three of them, Rob lifting her carefully, the stranger keeping the dog at bay with cautious patience, they managed to settle her in the back seat of Rob's truck. The dog, after a tense pause, leapt in beside her, resting its head protectively on her lap. Rob pressed a crumpled bill into the driver's hand. "Thanks. That's enough." The man only nodded, muttered something about the crazy things you see in these mountains, and drove off into the night. The cabin felt different when Rob carried her inside. He had long grown used to its silence, but now every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder. He laid her carefully on the old sofa, covering her with a wool blanket he hadn't used in years. The dog, Max, he would later learn, watched his every move, its eyes following him with suspicion and trust in equal measure. Rob moved with awkward gentleness. He filled a bowl with water, placed it near the dog, then searched the pantry for something edible. The only thing he had was a half-empty bag of kibble he sometimes used for strays. Max sniffed it, then devoured the food as though it hadn't eaten in days. Afterward, Rob fetched a towel, kneeling beside the dog. "You need this more than I do," he muttered, rubbing the mud from its fur. Max stiffened, then relaxed slowly under his touch. Rob almost smiled. It had been years since he had felt anything close to companionship. He turned back to the girl. She stirred once, lips parting as though caught in a dream. He checked her again, still breathing though shallow. He left a glass of water within reach and settled into his chair across the room. For the first time in years, Rob stayed awake through the night, not because of grief, but because of something uncertain, something like responsibility. By dawn, the forest outside was covered in mist. The first light spilled through the cabin window, painting the room in pale gray. Rob heard a rustle, then the creak of the sofa springs. The girl was awake. She blinked, confused, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room until it landed on him. Rob stood, cautious, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe," he said softly. "You passed out by the road. I brought you here." Her lips moved, voice barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" My place, just outside Stroudsburg. You've been out all night. He paused, then added gently, You should drink some water. She sat up slowly, Max pressing close to her side. She took the glass with shaking hands, sipping before setting it down again. Her eyes, clear but shadowed with fear, met his. Thank you, she said, her tone hesitant, as though unused to kindness. Then, after a long pause, she added quietly, My name is Sarah. Rob nodded once. Rob Mitchell. The silence stretched between them, fragile but steady, until Max broke it with a soft bark. Sarah reached down, stroking the dog's head, her lips curving into the faintest, most uncertain smile. And in that moment, Rob felt something shift. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew the night on the bridge hadn't been his last after all. For the first few minutes after she woke, Sarah barely spoke. She sat on the edge of the sofa, one hand resting on Max's head, the other gripping the blanket as though she feared it might vanish. Rob moved slowly around the room, brewing coffee that filled the cabin with a smell it hadn't carried in months. When he handed her a mug, she accepted it with both hands, eyes lowered. You have somewhere you need to be? He asked, his voice cautious, almost formal. Sarah shook her head, strands of dark hair falling across her face. No, nowhere. The silence that followed was heavy, but Rob recognized it. He had lived inside that kind of silence for years. She didn't want to explain, and he wasn't the kind of man to push. He leaned back against the counter, staring at her in the soft light of morning. Well, he said at last, this place has more room than I need. You can stay a while. No strings. Her eyes flicked up, surprise evident. Stay? As a guest. Or a friend, if you want to call it that. His tone was steady, practical, but inside, something about the words unsettled him. He had avoided company since the funeral. Now, without thinking, he was offering it. Sarah hesitated, then gave a small nod. Thank you. Just for a little while. From that day, the rhythm of the cabin began to change. Sarah started small, folding the blanket she had used, rinsing her mug without being asked. But within a week, she was doing more, wiping counters, sweeping the floor, reorganizing the shelves as if it were second nature. She cooked simple meals, the kind Rob hadn't bothered with since his wife died. The smell of fresh bread and simmering soup replaced the stale odor of beer and dust. Rob tried not to notice, but he did. Each evening when he returned from a walk, the cabin looked less like a tomb and more like a home. And yet, the distance between them remained. She never offered details about her life, and he never asked. Max, however, cared nothing for boundaries. The dog moved freely between them, his wagging tail and insistent presence softening the space. If Rob sat at the table too long, Max nudged his hand until he rose to take him outside. If Sarah looked too pale, Max climbed onto the sofa and pressed his warm body against her side. More than once, Rob caught himself smiling at the sight. One evening, after Sarah had made stew, Rob sat back in his chair and studied her. She was stirring her bowl absently, eyes distant. You're good at this, he said quietly. At what? Making a place feel alive again. Her lips curved in something like a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's easier to keep busy. Rob nodded. He knew that truth too well. The days slipped into a pattern. Sarah cleaned, cooked, and kept mostly to herself. Rob chopped wood, repaired things around the property, and stayed out of her way. They spoke in short exchanges, polite, careful, restrained. Yet beneath it all, an unspoken understanding grew. They were two broken people sharing the same space, each carrying ghosts the other couldn't see. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. In small towns near the Pocono foothills, change never stayed private for long. Mrs. Carter, who lived down the road, saw Sarah carrying groceries into the cabin and later told her sister-in-law that Rob Mitchell had finally let someone in. At the diner, whispers spread. He's not drinking alone every night anymore. There's a young woman staying with him. Maybe he's moving on. The gossip reached Rob eventually, through sideways glances and the way conversations hushed when he walked in. He ignored it, but deep down he knew what they meant. For years, people had pitied him, the widower who had lost everything. Now, they looked at him differently, almost expectantly, as if waiting to see whether life would return to him. Back at the cabin, he caught Sarah humming once while she worked, a tune soft and almost forgotten. The sound startled him, reminding him of a time before loss had carved him hollow. He didn't comment, but that night, as he sat by the window with a cup of coffee, he realized the air in the house felt lighter. Still, distance lingered. Sometimes he'd find her staring out the window for long stretches, her face shadowed with something he couldn't name. Sometimes she startled when he entered a room, as if pulled back from far away. He wanted to ask what haunted her, but the words never came. Instead, he let Max carry the weight of bridging the gap. The dog bounded between them, tail wagging, as if determined to stitch their lives together one moment at a time. And slowly, against the silence of the mountains, against the grief still gnawing at both their hearts, the cabin began to breathe again. The October evenings came early in the mountains. By 6, the forest outside was already cloaked in shadows, and the cabin glowed dimly under the soft light of a single lamp. Rob sat at the table with Sarah across from him, the remains of dinner between them. She had cooked again, chicken stew with biscuits, and though he rarely said much, he ate every bite. Tonight, however, the silence stretched longer than usual. He set down his spoon, fingers tracing the rim of his bowl. "You ever lose something," he asked slowly, "that you know you'll never get back?" Sarah stilled, her spoon hovering in midair. She didn't answer, and for a long moment, Rob thought she might rise and leave. But then she lowered the spoon gently, her eyes fixed on him. He drew in a breath, the words scraping out of him like rusted nails. "My wife, my boy. 3 years ago. Car accident. Some drunk came tearing through the intersection." His jaw tightened. They didn't make it. Sarah's face softened, her hands folding in her lap. Rob tried to hold himself steady, but the floodgates had opened. The man who did it walked free. Money and connections bought him a slap on the wrist. Suspended sentence. He laughed bitterly, though no humor touched the sound. The law was supposed to mean something. It didn't. His chest heaved as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I told myself I was done. With justice. With people. With everything. Sometimes I still think about ending it." The words hung heavy in the air. For years, he had carried them in silence, and now, spoken aloud, they shook him to the core. His eyes burned, and before he could stop himself, a tear slid down his cheek. He pressed a hand against his face, ashamed. But then he felt a light touch. Sarah had risen from her chair and stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. Rob turned slightly, his gaze catching hers. Her eyes shone with something he couldn't name. Sorrow, maybe, or recognition. She gave the smallest of nods, as though she understood grief too well. For the first time in years, the dam broke. His shoulders shook, and he let the tears come, silent but raw. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply stayed by his side, her hand steady against him, anchoring him as the weight poured out. When it was over, when he had nothing left but exhaustion, he sat slumped in the chair, his breath ragged. Sarah returned quietly to her seat, her expression unreadable. "You've lost someone too," he said finally, his voice hoarse. Her eyes flickered down to her hands. "I've lost more than I can explain." Rob waited, but she didn't elaborate. She only gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have the ground pulled out from under you." Something inside him ached to press further, to ask her what story lay behind those words. But he stopped himself. Whatever her pain was, she wasn't ready to share it. He understood that. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. Their conversations grew longer, though still careful. Rob found himself listening for her footsteps in the cabin, for the sound of her humming when she thought she was alone. He caught her watching him once as he split wood outside, her expression soft, almost wistful. And yet, whenever closeness seemed to take root, she pulled back. If he brushed her hand accidentally, she flinched, then forced a polite smile. If he lingered too long in conversation, she excused herself with some chore. It was as if she balanced on the edge of wanting connection and fearing it. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Rob found himself leaning closer. They were talking quietly about nothing in particular. Books she had read, the kind of music he used to play in the car. He noticed the way her lips curved, the warmth in her eyes. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened. He almost reached for her hand. Almost. But then she shifted, her gaze dropping to Max, who lay stretched across the rug. She bent down, stroking the dog's head, as if reminding herself of the safe distance she needed to keep. Rob leaned back, the moment dissolving. Sarah straightened and glanced at him briefly, her smile tight. "It's late. We should get some rest." He nodded, swallowing whatever words had been rising in his throat. That night, as he lay awake listening to the creak of the old cabin, he realized they were bound by a strange thread: grief, loss, the hollow spaces left behind. But while he had let her glimpse his scars, she kept hers hidden behind walls he couldn't yet reach. And so, their lives moved forward in a fragile dance, moments of closeness, quickly shadowed by retreat. The cabin held their silences, their half-finished words, their almost touches, and though neither dared to name it, something had begun to take root between them, fragile as a flame in the wind. It was late one night when Sarah finally began to unravel her story. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the cabin roof, and the fire snapped in the hearth. Rob sat in his chair, Max curled at his feet, when Sarah drew in a long breath and spoke without looking at him. "My family wasn't like most families around here," she began, her voice low but clear. "We had money, not the kind you stumble into, but the kind that gets passed down generation after generation. My father owned a manufacturing company out of Allentown. He built it with his own hands, grew it into something solid. He always said one day it would be mine." Rob turned slightly, listening, careful not to interrupt. "My mother was softer, gentle, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it feel safe. She believed in kindness, in listening before speaking. And then there was Lauren." Her lips curved, but there was no warmth in the smile. "Lauren was my little sister, younger by 3 years, but always louder, brighter, more demanding. My father adored her, but not the way he trusted me. He used to say I had his head for business. Lauren didn't want that. She wanted everything else, the attention, the freedom, the spotlight. And when she couldn't get it, she made sure everyone knew she'd been wronged." Sarah shifted in her chair, staring into the fire. "Dad was clear about it. He wanted me to take over the company when the time came. Lauren never forgave me for that. She hid it under jokes and smiles, but I could feel it. She thought I was stealing her place in the world." The flames flickered, shadows cutting across her face. And then came Christopher Dalton. She paused on the name, as though tasting bitterness. He was handsome, charming, the son of one of my father's business partners. On paper, it was perfect. A merger, not just of companies, but of families. My father approved right away. He thought Chris would be good for the future of the business. My mother, not so much. Her voice softened with memory. Mom never trusted him. She never said it outright, not at first, but I could feel it. She'd look at him with this suspicion in her eyes. Once, after he proposed, she pulled me aside. She asked if I was sure. She said he seemed too polished, too rehearsed, like a man trying on an act. I told her she was wrong. I told her I loved him. Rob's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Sarah's gaze dropped to the fire, and I did, or at least I thought I did. He was attentive, romantic, everything I believed a man should be. He told me I was his whole world, that no one else could ever matter. I was young and I wanted so badly to believe it. So I did. She let out a shaky breath. When we announced our engagement, Lauren put on the show of her life. She smiled, hugged me, told everyone she was thrilled for me. But I saw her eyes when no one else was looking. Cold, angry, as if I had taken something from her, though I couldn't understand what. Max stirred, resting his head on Sarah's lap. Her hand drifted to stroke his fur absently, grounding herself in the touch. The wedding was grand. My father spared no expense. Guests filled the hall. Music played until morning. To everyone, it looked like the perfect match, two families uniting, a bright future ahead. And Lauren stood by my side, smiling like she was proud. But I knew her too well. Underneath the smile, she hated me for it. Hated that I had my father's trust, the company's future, and now a husband she couldn't control. Her voice cracked slightly as she went on. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that once she saw me happy, she'd let go of her bitterness. But I was wrong. I didn't see how deep it ran. I didn't see what it would cost me. Rob leaned forward slightly, his face etched with quiet concern. He didn't push, didn't ask her to go faster. He let her carry the story at her own pace. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in Max's fur. Looking back, I think my mother saw it coming. She saw the storm gathering around me, even when I was blind to it. But I was in love, or at least I believed I was. And love, it makes you deaf sometimes. Deaf to warnings, deaf to reason. I thought I had everything. A family that trusted me, a future waiting, and a man who promised me the world. Her eyes lifted finally, meeting Rob's. They were filled with shadows, the kind that only came from old wounds. But I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I didn't even know it. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Rob said nothing. He simply nodded, his steady gaze telling her he heard every word. And Sarah Caldwell, for the first time, allowed a sliver of her past to step into the room, heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. The early months of Sarah's marriage played out like a script she had once dreamed of. Christopher Dalton was attentive in public, the perfect husband, the perfect son-in-law. Her father praised him at every dinner, already speaking of the future with renewed confidence. "The company will be stronger with you at the helm, Sarah," he told her more than once, his voice full of pride. "And with Chris by your side, there's nothing you can't manage." It was clear what he meant. The transition of power was close. He was preparing to hand her the keys to the business he had built from nothing. To Sarah, it felt like stepping into her destiny, honoring her father's trust, carrying the family legacy forward. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. She remembered the night she first stumbled onto the truth. It was late, the house quiet. She had gone upstairs to find Christopher, only to hear voices through the half-open door of his study. One voice was unmistakably his, the other her sister's, Lauren's. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She leaned closer, every word carving into her like glass. "She believes every word I tell her," Christopher was saying, his tone cold, calculating. Lauren's laugh followed, sharp and bitter. "Of course she does. She's always believed she's smarter than me. Let her think that. Once she's out of the picture, the company is ours." Sarah's knees weakened. She clutched the banister to keep from collapsing, every instinct screaming to burst in and demand answers. But her body wouldn't move. She stood there in silence, listening to the man she loved and the sister she trusted, conspiring to erase her from her own life. The days after that blurred into dread. She carried the knowledge like a hidden wound, forcing smiles at family dinners, pretending not to notice the glances between Lauren and Christopher. At night, she lay awake beside him, the echo of their voices burning in her ears. Then came the trip to the mountains. Christopher had suggested it, saying they all needed a break. The Pocono trails were familiar, a place Sarah had hiked since childhood. Her father stayed behind for business meetings, but Lauren insisted on joining. "Sister's time," she said brightly, her smile stretched too wide. The climb started peacefully enough, the air crisp, the forest alive with color. But as they reached the ridge, Sarah felt the shift. The narrow path wound along a cliffside, the ground damp from morning rain. She glanced at Lauren, who lingered just a step too close, her eyes glinting with something Sarah couldn't mistake anymore. They stopped near an overlook, the valley stretching below in a breathtaking sweep of green and stone. Sarah stepped to the edge, her chest tightening. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Behind her, Lauren's footsteps slowed. "You've always had everything, haven't you?" Lauren's voice was flat, almost calm. Sarah turned slowly. "That's not true. You had Dad's trust, his company, and now Chris." Her eyes narrowed. "You were never going to share. You were never going to let me have a piece of it." Sarah's stomach dropped. "You don't know what you're saying. You think Chris loves you? You think he's not using you like—" Lauren lunged forward. It happened fast, too fast. Sarah felt the shove against her shoulder, the ground crumbling beneath her boots. She gasped, arms flailing, fingers clawing at the air. For a heartbeat, she was certain she would fall. The world tilted, the valley yawning below. But it was Lauren who slipped. Her foot skidded on the wet rock, her balance gone. She let out a sharp cry as her body pitched forward. Sarah reached instinctively, their fingers brushing for the briefest second before Lauren's hand slid away. And then she was gone. The sound of the fall echoed through the gorge, a hollow thud swallowed by silence. Sarah staggered back, her body shaking, her breath tearing from her chest. She dropped to her knees, staring into the void, waiting for a miracle that never came. Panic consumed her. She could already see how it would look. Her sister dead, her husband's betrayal still hidden. Who would believe her? Who would believe that Lauren had tried to kill her and that her death had been an accident of her own making? She ran. Through the trees, down the path, her lungs burning, her mind screaming. She didn't stop until she was miles from the trailhead, mud streaking her clothes, her hands raw from grabbing at branches. She didn't go home. She didn't call the police. By the time she reached the nearest town, word had already spread. A body had been found, or at least so people thought. In the confusion, in the chaos, her identity blurred. She heard whispers in the days that followed. It was Sarah. Sarah had fallen. Lauren survived. Somewhere, a coffin was lowered into the ground with her name on the stone. Somewhere, her parents wept for a daughter they thought they had lost. And Sarah Caldwell, still alive, was forced into the cruelest disguise of all. To survive, she became Lauren. In the weeks after the fall, Sarah moved like a ghost. She left the mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back, her hands trembling each time she caught her reflection in a shop window. To the world, she was Lauren now. The mix-up at the scene had set the story. Sarah Caldwell had fallen to her death. Lauren had survived. She didn't correct it. She couldn't. She drifted from one small town to another, paying for cheap rooms with the cash she had hidden in her jacket pocket. She used her sister's name whenever someone asked. It came out stiff at first, like an ill-fitting coat, but soon it became the only thing that kept her from unraveling. If Christopher thought Lauren lived, he wouldn't search for Sarah. And if the world thought Sarah was dead, maybe she could disappear. But at night, when the motel lights flickered and the silence pressed too close, she heard her parents' voices. She pictured her father at the graveside, shoulders bent under grief. She pictured her mother's tears, the disbelief etched into her gentle face. The weight of it crushed Sarah's chest. She was alive, yet she had left them to bury the wrong daughter. The guilt was relentless. She tried to write once, an anonymous letter, a message that might reach them without revealing too much. But the words died on the page. How could she explain the truth? That their trusted son-in-law had betrayed them? That Lauren had conspired to kill her? That she had run, leaving them to mourn the wrong child? No, she thought bitterly they would never believe it. And so she let the lie stand. It was during those lost months that Max came into her life. She had found the pup outside a gas station on the outskirts of Scranton, shivering under a rusted dumpster. He was all ribs and fear, his eyes too big for his small body. She crouched down, whispered gently, and the pup crawled into her arms as though he had been waiting for her. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Max grew quickly, his loyalty fierce, his presence a tether that kept her from vanishing completely. But fear shadowed every step she took. Each time she spotted a man in a suit at the corner of a diner, she imagined Christopher had sent someone to find her. Each time she saw a familiar car in the distance, her pulse spiked. He was powerful now, richer than before, and she knew what he was capable of. If he learned she lived, he would finish what he had started. She found work where she could, cleaning motel rooms, stocking shelves at a supermarket, serving coffee in backroad diners. Always for cash, always under the name Lauren Caldwell. Her life shrank to the essentials: food, shelter, safety. Max became her only constant. She slept with him curled against her side, his warm weight the only thing that steadied her trembling at night. Back in Allentown, her family held a funeral. She read about it in a small local paper she had dared to pick up in a diner. The article was short, almost cruel in its simplicity. Sarah Caldwell, beloved daughter and wife, laid to rest after tragic accident. There was a picture of her smiling face, her real face, printed above the obituary. She dropped the paper as if it had burned her fingers. She imagined the scene, the casket lowered into the earth, her parents clutching one another, Christopher standing by with that carefully practiced grief written across his face. The thought made her stomach twist. He had taken everything: her marriage, her family's trust, her identity, and yet he still walked free, respected, powerful. For 3 years, she lived like that, moving town to town, looking over her shoulder, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Each day, she carried the gnawing dread that the truth would catch up with her, and the shame that she had let her family bury a daughter who wasn't gone. By the time she collapsed on that roadside, Sarah Caldwell was a woman hollowed out by secrets. Her body had grown thin, her eyes shadowed, her spirit worn down to threads. If not for Max, she might have given up entirely. And then came Rob. The night he found her was not just another night of wandering. It was the end of her strength. When she woke in his cabin, she felt the fragile safety of being seen and not questioned. Rob asked for nothing, demanded nothing. He offered a roof, a warm meal, and silence that wasn't hostile. But the secret weighed heavier in the presence of his kindness. Each time she caught him watching her with quiet concern, guilt pressed sharper. He didn't know who she really was. He didn't know the trail of lies that led her to his door. And the thought of him finding out made her heart pound with dread. Still, a part of her clung to the fragile thread of hope. Perhaps fate hadn't left her to rot in shadows. Perhaps meeting Rob was more than coincidence. But hope was dangerous, and Sarah Caldwell had learned to fear anything that resembled light. She sat by his fire at night, Max curled at her feet, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She said little, but her silence carried the weight of everything unspoken. Rob didn't press. He let her be. And yet, even in the quiet, she felt her secret clawing at her chest, desperate to be told, terrified of the cost. Meeting him was salvation. Carrying her truth was damnation. And Sarah knew she couldn't keep both forever. The turning point came one cold November evening. Rob and Sarah sat in the cabin, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. She had been pacing for nearly an hour, her hands twisting together, her face pale with the weight of her secret. Finally, Rob spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can't keep running forever, Sarah. He's out there living free while you hide. That's not survival, it's a prison." Her eyes filled with panic. You don't understand what he's capable of. If Christopher finds out I'm alive, he already tried to take your life once, Rob interrupted, leaning forward. If you stay silent, he wins. If you face him, you take back control. She shook her head, tears brimming. I can't. My family buried me. They think Lauren lived. If I come back, how do I even explain that? Rob's voice softened. You explain it with the truth, and I'll be there with you. It took days of convincing, of patient words and quiet determination before Sarah agreed. Rob put his old skills to use, skills he had abandoned when he left law enforcement. He followed Christopher Dalton, learning his routines, the restaurants he favored, the exact table he chose when dining alone. He still carried himself like a man untouchable, his suit sharp, his smile polished, his reputation intact. But Rob saw the cracks, the loneliness in his habits, the arrogance in his patterns. The plan was simple. Rob would lead Sarah into the restaurant at the exact moment Christopher least expected. He would be forced to face her, and his own guilt would do the rest. Rob had prepared a small recorder, tucked neatly into Sarah's purse, ensuring every word would be preserved. On the chosen afternoon, Sarah dressed plainly, her hair tied back, her nerves taut as wires. Rob's steady hand at her back was the only thing that kept her moving forward. The restaurant's bell chimed as they entered, the smell of grilled meat and wine heavy in the air. Christopher Dalton sat at his usual table near the window, cutting into a steak. He glanced up casually, then froze. His fork clattered against the plate, his face draining of color. "Hello, Chris," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She slid into the chair across from him, Rob standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Christopher's lips parted, but no words came. He blinked hard, as though trying to erase the vision in front of him. This isn't possible." "Oh, it's possible," Sarah said. Her hands trembled under the table, but her gaze didn't waver. "You're looking at the woman you and my sister tried to erase." He swallowed, his throat working visibly. You fell. They buried you. They buried a name," she snapped. "But I'm still here, and I remember everything. The late-night meetings, the whispers, the plan to make sure the company passed into your hands." Christopher's composure faltered. He darted a glance around the restaurant, but the midday crowd paid little attention. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Keep your voice down." "Why?" Sarah challenged. "Afraid someone might hear the truth? That you seduced my sister to use her against me? That you sent me hiking so she could push me off the cliff?" Rob's jaw clenched, every muscle taut as he stood guard. Christopher's mask slipped. His eyes darkened, his tone sharp. "You don't understand. Your father was never going to let me near the company unless you were out of the way. You had everything, his trust, the future. Lauren was easy to manipulate. She wanted what you had. All I had to do was give her what she craved, and she did the rest." Sarah's chest heaved. "So you admit it. You never loved me. You never loved her. It was always about power." He sneered. "Love is a tool. Some of us know how to use it." The words cut deeper than any blade. Sarah's hands shook, but she pressed on. "And when Lauren died instead of me?" Christopher shrugged, though his hand trembled as he lifted his glass. "Collateral damage. She wasn't worth much to me without you to push against. But at least everyone believed the story. Sarah dead, Lauren alive. It worked in my favor." Every word fell neatly into the recorder's memory, each syllable sealing his fate. Rob stepped closer, his presence looming. "That's enough." Christopher's eyes flicked up, recognizing him for the first time. Something cold passed between them, the steady strength of a man who had seen justice fail too many times and was ready to restore it by force if needed. "Who the hell are you?" Christopher demanded. "The man who's going to make sure you finally pay," Rob said evenly. Christopher rose suddenly, knocking over his chair, but Rob's hand clamped on his arm before he could bolt. Within minutes, the police arrived, called ahead by Rob, who had made sure backup was waiting. The officers listened as Sarah handed over the recording, her voice steady as she recounted the betrayal, the plot, the near murder. Christopher tried to protest, to weave excuses, but the evidence was damning. His words, his tone, his arrogance, all preserved on tape. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and for the first time, his polished mask shattered into raw panic. Sarah watched as they led him out, her hands trembling but her spine straight. The man who had stolen her life, her family, her very identity was finally stripped of power. Rob stood beside her, steady as ever. "It's over," he said quietly. She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No, it's just beginning. I still have to face my family." Rob placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Then we'll face them together." And for the first time in years, Sarah felt the air in her lungs ease. The shadows had started to lift, replaced by the faintest glimmer of justice. The days following Christopher's arrest blurred into a mixture of exhaustion and fragile relief. Sarah spent hours at the station, giving her statement, repeating the story she had carried in silence for 3 years. The recording left little room for denial, his voice, cold and arrogant, admitting everything. But even with justice set in motion, a greater challenge remained: going home. When Rob drove her back to Allentown, the city of her childhood, she sat stiff in the passenger seat, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Max leaned forward from the back seat, resting his chin on her shoulder as though sensing the storm within her. She hadn't seen her parents since the funeral, the one they believed was hers. The thought of their faces when they opened the door made her chest ache with guilt. The Caldwell house loomed large as they pulled into the driveway. Its windows glowed with warm light, so familiar and yet impossibly distant. Rob cut the engine, resting a steady hand on hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. Sarah nodded, drawing in a shaky breath. Together, they walked up the stone path. When her mother answered the door, the world seemed to still. For a moment, neither moved. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Then the tears came, her voice breaking on a single word. "Sarah?" Sarah's own tears spilled over. "It's me, Mom. I'm alive." They collapsed into each other's arms, trembling, sobbing, clinging as though afraid the other might vanish. Her father appeared moments later, his face pale as he stumbled forward, then froze, torn between joy and grief. "But they told us you were gone. We buried you." "I know," Sarah whispered through tears. "I let you think that. I was so afraid, and I didn't know how to explain. I thought you wouldn't believe me." Her father's voice cracked. "We lost one daughter, and all this time you were out there alone." He pulled her into his embrace, his arms tight, unrelenting, as though trying to make up for the years of absence. But the joy of reunion soon gave way to sorrow when the truth came out. Sarah sat with them in the living room. Max curled at her feet, Rob close at her side. She told them everything: Christopher's lies, Lauren's betrayal, the hike that turned deadly. She confessed the guilt she had carried, the weight of letting them mourn the wrong child. Her mother wept openly, pressing tissues to her face. Her father stared into the fire, his jaw set against the tremor in his hands. "Lauren," he said, finally, his voice raw. "All this time we thought she had survived and she was the one who tried to—" His words faltered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. "It doesn't mean you loved her less," Sarah said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "She was still your daughter, but she chose a path that destroyed us all." Her mother reached across the table, clutching Sarah's hand. "We have you back. That's what matters now. The rest we'll have to live with, no matter how much it hurts." And so, piece by piece, the healing began. The community that had whispered for years about the Caldwell tragedy now whispered something else. That Sarah had returned, alive, carrying the truth that shattered illusions but restored justice. Her father's company welcomed her cautiously at first, then firmly once the court hearings against Christopher revealed the depth of his fraud. Sarah was no longer a ghost in hiding. She was herself again. Through it all, Rob stood beside her. The man who had once lost his faith in justice found it stirring back to life as he watched Sarah reclaim her name. She gave him purpose in a way the badge never could. And she, in turn, found strength in his steady presence, the kind that didn't ask for more than she could give. One crisp winter morning, weeks after the trial, Rob and Sarah walked through the forest trails near his cabin. The snow lay in soft blankets, crunching under their boots. Max bounded ahead, his joyful barks echoing off the trees. Sarah's hand slipped into Rob's, her fingers warm despite the cold. "I never thought I'd see this," she said quietly, gazing at the sunlight breaking through the pines. "Peace, a future." Rob squeezed her hand. "Neither did I." They stopped at a ridge, looking down at the valley where so much of their pain had once lived. Now, with the world stretched before them, it felt like something new, something unbroken. Max trotted back, nudging Rob's leg before settling at their feet, panting happily. Sarah knelt, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "He saved me," she whispered. "But so did you." Rob bent slightly, his voice low but certain. "We saved each other." As they stood together, watching the sun climb higher, the darkness of the past seemed to loosen its hold. Their scars would never vanish, but they had found something stronger than grief, something that could carry them forward. Hand in hand, with Max bounding at their side, they stepped onto the trail once more. The Pocono Woods, once a place of death and betrayal, now became the backdrop of a new beginning. And for Rob Mitchell and Sarah Caldwell, the story no longer belonged to loss. It belonged to healing. The door clicked shut behind her, and Evelyn didn't know it then, but that was the last time she would ever see her mother. Karen Blake hadn't even turned around. No quis goodbye, no promise. Just a tight-lipped smile and a sharp be good. Then she walked away, her heels clacking down the linoleum hallway of the Mountain View Youth Center in Asheville, North Carolina. Evelyn stood frozen in the entryway, a frayed backpack dangling from one shoulder, clutching the stuffed rabbit her mom had handed her seconds earlier like some kind of consolation prize. She was only 7, but something in her gut already knew something was terribly wrong. A staff worker knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her back, but Evelyn couldn't hear her voice. Everything had gone quiet, like the world had suddenly muffled itself in cotton. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the voices around her, louder than the creak of the institutional doors, louder than her own breath. "Is this a sleepover?" she asked that night, curling into the unfamiliar sheets, her bunk just inches away from another child's. "Is my mom coming back tomorrow?" The girl in the next bed didn't even look up. "It's not a sleepover. It's a dump." Evelyn blinked. She said she'd be back in 2 days. That's what mine said, too. It's been a year. The words didn't register. Evelyn repeated her mother's promise in her head like a mantra. 2 days, maybe 3. She's just busy. Something came up. Adults had emergencies all the time, but she'd come back. She had to. 2 days turned into a week. Then 2. Then Christmas passed. Then spring. By summer, Evelyn had stopped asking to use the front office phone. By fall, she had memorized the taste of disappointment. She never cried in front of the others. She waited until nighttime, when the bunk bed squeaked with restless turning and muffled her sobs into the same pillow every night. She stopped looking out the front window after the first year. But what broke her wasn't the abandonment, it was the silence. No letter, no call, not even an excuse. Evelyn created stories in her head to survive the weight of that silence. Maybe her mother had been in a car crash and forgotten everything. Maybe she was in a coma. Maybe someone had taken her away. Any fantasy, no matter how wild, was better than believing the truth that her own mother simply chose to leave her behind. Evelyn became the quiet one, the polite one, the straight-A girl who never caused trouble. She learned quickly that the kids who screamed and acted out were punished or forgotten. But the ones who followed the rules, sometimes they were noticed. Sometimes they got picked. But Evelyn didn't want to be picked by strangers. She only wanted one person to walk through that door. On the morning of her 9th birthday, she sat on the front steps of the center for 6 hours, clutching a handmade card and a yellow hair clip she'd saved to give back to her mother. The staff eventually coaxed her inside with a cupcake and a candle. She didn't eat it. She just stared at the flickering flame until it burned out on its own. 3 years passed, then 5. No one came. It was during those hollow years that Evelyn learned how to disappear without leaving. She faded into walls. She smiled when spoken to. She kept her pain neat and folded, like a secret hidden beneath her mattress. The counselors praised her maturity. Other kids called her weird. But Evelyn had a mission. Survive now, ask questions later. The only thing that pulled her out of that fog was the day she met Caleb. He arrived at the center 2 weeks after she turned 11. A quiet, lanky boy with stormy eyes and a scar across his left brow. No one knew where he'd come from, only that he didn't talk much. The older boys mocked him for keeping to himself. They cornered him behind the cafeteria one afternoon, taunting him, pushing him around. Evelyn saw it from the window, and something inside her snapped. She stormed outside, fists clenched. "Back off," she shouted. 5 against 1? Real brave. The tallest of the group sneered. "Beat it, Blake. No one asked you." "Walk away," she said calmly, "or I'll tell Coach Ritter what you're doing." That name, Coach Ritter, was enough. The boys mumbled and scattered. Evelyn stood her ground until the last of them had disappeared around the corner. Then she turned to Caleb. He was trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. "Why'd you do that?" "Because I've been that kid," she said. "And because you looked like you needed someone." That was all it took. From that moment on, they were inseparable. They didn't talk about their pasts, not at first. They built a world of their own, made of library books and whispered dreams. On rainy days, they drew houses with huge windows and warm kitchens. They promised that one day they'd leave the center together and never look back. But Evelyn still had one unanswered question buried deep in her chest. Why? Why did her mother leave? And would she ever dare to ask if she got the chance? Or worse, what if she already knew the answer? For the next 5 years, Caleb became Evelyn's shadow and her light. They didn't just share meals and classes and the occasional stolen candy bar. They shared silence, the kind that didn't feel awkward, only safe. In a place where the walls were too thin and the rules too many, Caleb was the one thing that never felt conditional. He didn't need her to smile or speak or explain. He just sat beside her when the days were too heavy and stayed. By the time Evelyn turned 16, the Mountain View Youth Center had become a waiting room for dreams she refused to give up. She studied relentlessly, her mind sharper than most, fueled not by ambition but defiance. Every scholarship application was a brick in the wall she was building between herself and the past. Caleb watched her pore over textbooks late into the night under flickering hallway lights, sometimes sitting on the floor beside her just to remind her she wasn't alone. He, too, was growing. Taller, quieter, stronger. He didn't speak much about why his grandmother never came to pick him up like she had promised. Evelyn never pressed him for answers. They both understood what it meant to live in the pause between promises and reality. One evening during study hour, she looked up from her notebook and whispered, "Do you think they ever think of us?" Caleb blinked. "Who?" "Them. The people who leave." He paused for a long time before answering. "Maybe, but not the way we want them to." Evelyn didn't reply. She just nodded and turned back to her paper. That night, she cried for the first time in years. Quietly, into her pillow. Caleb didn't say anything, but he sat on the edge of her bed until she fell asleep. They made it a ritual to walk the perimeter fence every Sunday afternoon. The staff didn't like it, but they allowed it. During those walks, they planned the life they didn't yet have. She would become an interior designer. He would be an architect. They'd build homes that felt like safety for people who had never known it. Their dream wasn't luxury. It was dignity. Caleb once said, "I want to design places where no one feels like they have to apologize for existing." Evelyn had stared at him, then really stared, and something shifted in her chest. But she didn't name it. Not yet. When she turned 18, Evelyn packed her things into a duffel bag and walked out the same door she had entered as a child. No one came to see her off, except Caleb. He was standing outside with a sandwich wrapped in foil and a folded envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Fuel and hope," he said. Inside the envelope was a drawing he'd made years ago, a house with a blue roof and wide windows. On the bottom corner, in his neat handwriting, it said, "You build the inside. I'll build the outside." Evelyn didn't say anything. She just hugged him tighter than she ever had. They didn't make promises that day. Promises they both knew were fragile. But they exchanged something deeper, a quiet commitment. In the years that followed, Evelyn poured herself into college life in Denver. She took on part-time jobs, worked late shifts at a coffee shop, and sent Caleb postcards every month, never signed with love, always still here. Caleb attended a community college nearby and transferred into an architecture program by his second year. His letters were shorter but steadier. When they could, they met at halfway points. A diner off I-70, a bookstore cafe with a crooked sign. It didn't matter where, just that they still showed up. One snowy December evening, sitting on a bus bench after Evelyn's final exam, Caleb handed her a small box. "What's this?" she asked. "Just open it." Inside was a key, silver worn, attached to a plain tag that read Unit 3B. "It's not much," he said. "Just a tiny place near Boulder. But it's 2 bedrooms. You could, I don't know, crash there for the summer. Or longer." She stared at the key like it might vanish. "You're offering me a place to live?" "I'm offering you home, Evelyn." Her hands trembled. Not because she was afraid, but because something in her heart had finally found a soft place to land. She moved in 3 weeks later. Their apartments were side by side, 3A and 3B. The walls were thin, the plumbing outdated, but it was theirs. Evelyn decorated her side with thrifted curtains and DIY shelves. Caleb installed a new lock on her door and fixed the dripping sink. They didn't live together, not exactly, but they shared groceries, shared Sunday laundry, shared space in a way that felt more intimate than romance, more durable than friendship. Until one night, just before her graduation, Evelyn stood outside his door with a bottle of cheap wine and a question burning on her lips. "What are we, Caleb?" He looked up from his drafting table, pen still in hand. "We're us." It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. Evelyn didn't press. She wasn't ready to name it either. But in the silence that followed, her heart whispered what neither of them dared to say aloud. "I love you." The day Evelyn Blake graduated, she didn't wear her cap at an angle or paint her name across the top like the other girls. She wore it straight, pressed down like armor. When her name echoed through the auditorium, she walked across the stage with a calm so focused it looked like grace. In the crowd, there was no cheering, no proud parent holding a sign. Just Caleb, standing quietly at the very back, clapping until his hands stung. When she stepped outside into the June heat, he was waiting with a thermos of iced coffee and a bouquet of lavender. "You did it," he said. Evelyn smiled. "We did." That summer, Evelyn didn't rest. She interned at a boutique design firm in downtown Boulder that specialized in restoring old Victorian homes. She swept floors, took measurements, memorized fabric swatches, and sat in on client meetings she wasn't paid to attend. She didn't care. Every detail she absorbed felt like a step toward the future she'd been sketching since she was 9. At night, She'd come home, kick off her shoes, and walk next door. Caleb would already have dinner simmering on the stove. Something cheap and filling, often involving pasta. They didn't need to talk much. A glance, a shared laugh, a sigh over a day gone wrong. This was their rhythm. On weekends, they built furniture together out of reclaimed wood. Caleb did the sawing. Evelyn did the staining. Neither of them said it, but both knew this wasn't just friendship anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Still, the words remained unsaid. One afternoon in September, Evelyn received an unexpected email. A senior designer at the firm was taking a year-long sabbatical, and her supervisor wanted Evelyn to fill the gap. Full-time, with a salary. She stared at the screen for nearly an hour before calling Caleb. He picked up on the first ring. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, voice trembling. "Something's right." That night, they opened a bottle of cheap champagne and toasted on the balcony of her apartment. "To survival," she said. "To building," Caleb added. The following months passed in a blur of projects and proposals. Evelyn threw herself into work, earning the trust of clients and coworkers alike. She had a natural instinct for balance, how a room should feel, not just how it should look. Her designs weren't flashy, but they were thoughtful, precise, and warm. Homes with soul. Meanwhile, Caleb graduated and landed a job with a mid-sized architecture firm that handled both residential and commercial builds. His talent for clean, modern lines, paired with structural intuition, earned him praise from colleagues and clients. But what he loved most was still the idea they had built together as kids. Homes for people who needed them. He kept a small notebook with sketches labeled Blake and Morgan Design Studio and showed it to no one but Evelyn. One Friday evening, she found it on his coffee table while he was in the shower. Flipping through the pages, she saw floor plans, sketches of rooms that reminded her of the orphanage, but warmer, better, safer. In the margin of one drawing, he'd written, "For Evelyn, the only home I've ever had." When Caleb came out, towel slung over his shoulder, she was holding the notebook. "You weren't supposed to see that." She didn't say anything, just smiled and kissed him. It was soft, familiar, long overdue. That night, they didn't sleep in separate apartments. And in the morning, neither of them slipped away. From then on, things shifted, but gently. They still had separate leases, but now, Evelyn's toothbrush lived at his place, and his sweaters found permanent homes in her closet. They cooked together, worked side by side on weekend sketches, and slowly started laying the foundation of something neither had dared imagine too soon. It wasn't perfect. Caleb was messy. Evelyn was stubborn. They fought about cabinet space and how to load the dishwasher, but none of it mattered. They had survived worse, much worse, and for the first time in their lives, they were allowed to dream in color. After a year of saving, they launched their own design studio, Blake and Morgan Designs. It started in the corner of their shared living room with 2 desks, 1 printer, and a second-hand Keurig. Evelyn handled interiors and client presentations. Caleb focused on plans and permits. Together, they worked 12-hour days, took every job that came in, and said yes more than they probably should have. Some nights, they fell asleep at their desks. Others, they lay awake in bed talking about how far they'd come. Once, after signing their first major renovation contract, Evelyn whispered into Caleb's shoulder, "I used to think being left behind defined me." He kissed the top of her head. "Now you define everything else." But not everything was easy. Beneath Evelyn's joy lived a quiet ache, a longing that no success could silence. She wanted to be a mother. It started small. The way she lingered around children in client meetings, the way she paused in front of baby boutiques, the way her voice softened when she saw tiny shoes lined up by a front door. She never said it out loud, until one night, curled against Caleb after a long day, she whispered, "Do you ever think about kids?" He was silent for a moment. Then, sometimes. That was all. No discussion, no follow-up, and that somehow hurt more than a no. Evelyn stared at the ceiling long after Caleb fell asleep, wondering if building a life meant she had to give up part of the one she still dreamed of, or if she was asking for too much. It happened on a Wednesday, not Valentine's Day, not Christmas, not some anniversary circled on the calendar. Just a crisp, quiet evening in early October, the kind of evening when the air smelled like leaves and cinnamon, and the light dipped early behind the mountains. Evelyn came home late from a client consultation, her shoulders aching, her heels kicked off the moment she stepped through the door. Caleb had said he'd be working late too, but the apartment was warm, lit, glowing with something soft and golden. "Caleb," she called. No answer. Then she saw it. The living room had been transformed. Candles flickered on every surface, and in the middle of the room stood a tall easel, draped with a linen sheet. Her heart skipped. On the kitchen table sat her favorite takeout, Thai with extra spring rolls and a single wine glass filled to the brim with red. A small card sat next to it, "For the girl who taught me how to make a house a home." She turned toward the easel, her pulse rising. Slowly, she pulled the sheet away. It was a blueprint, framed, detailed, beautiful. A home. Not flashy, not extravagant, but familiar. It looked like the house they used to draw as kids. Same wraparound porch. Same library window. At the bottom corner, in his same steady handwriting, it said, "For us." Tears welled in her eyes. Then the door creaked, open behind her. Caleb stepped in, wearing a navy suit she had only seen once before, at a friend's wedding. His hair was neatly combed, his face calm but pale. He walked slowly toward her, something clutched in his hand. "You remember when we were 13, he began, "and you told me the only thing you ever wanted was to wake up every morning in a house no one could take away from you." She nodded, barely breathing. "Well, I can't promise forever, but I can promise this, my name beside yours on every document, every door frame, every lease, every mortgage, and every memory." He held out a small velvet box, and when he opened it, Evelyn didn't see the ring first. She saw his hands, shaking slightly, then his eyes steady. The ring was delicate, gold, with a sapphire set in the center. Blue, like the roofs they always drew. "Evelyn Blake," he said, "will you marry me?" She didn't answer at first, just looked at him, at the blueprint behind her, at the candlelight, at the life they had built. Messy, beautiful, unfinished, and then she nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around him, laughter breaking through her tears. They stood in the center of the apartment, holding each other like they were anchoring reality in place. They didn't need champagne, or a crowd, or fireworks. They had promises, finally made aloud. Later that night, curled together on the couch, Evelyn stared at the framed blueprint across the room. Her finger traced the ring again and again, as if to remind herself it was real. "You really think we can build this?" she asked softly. Caleb kissed her temple. "We already have." Plans moved fast. Not the wedding. No, neither of them cared much for frills, but the business. With the engagement came a surge of energy. They took on new clients, started hiring freelancers, built a simple website, and even rented a tiny office space on the corner of Maple and Ninth. It wasn't glamorous, but it had a window. A real one, facing the street. They painted the walls themselves, white and light gray. Evelyn brought in potted plants, and Caleb installed a chalkboard wall where they scribbled deadlines, measurements, and sometimes, when no one was looking, little notes to each other. One afternoon, Evelyn wrote in big letters, "Someday a nursery." She watched Caleb glance at it, then look away. Her heart tightened, but she didn't erase it. Instead, she drew a tiny heart beside it and went back to work. The business grew faster than they expected. Their styles complemented each other. Clients loved their synergy. Their home life remained quiet, but steady. Sunday pancakes, late-night sketches, shared headphones on the couch. But the silence about the one thing Evelyn longed for began to stretch wider. At her yearly checkup, Her doctor suggested a fertility test. Evelyn went alone. The results came back normal. The doctor smiled kindly and said, "You're in perfect condition to carry. You just need to give it time." Time. But Evelyn was already 30. She had waited her whole life for stability, for love, for home. She didn't want to wait anymore. That night, she brought it up gently over dinner. "Would you be willing to get checked too? Just to rule it out?" Caleb set down his fork. "I don't think we need to jump into all that. Maybe it's just not the right time." "But it's been over a year, Caleb." He nodded slowly but didn't meet her eyes. "I just don't want to start treating this like a problem." Evelyn didn't answer, because to her, it was already a problem. Not the infertility, but the distance it created. She smiled through the rest of the meal, but her chest felt tight. That night, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering how to ask for something so primal without sounding demanding. She wanted a baby. She wanted to be a mother. She wanted to pass on something other than abandonment. She wanted to be proof that people could come back from being left behind. But Caleb didn't seem to want the same future, and she didn't know how long her heart could wait in silence. 3 months after their engagement, Evelyn and Caleb signed the lease on a modest commercial unit just outside downtown Boulder. It used to be a bakery. Faded tile floors, ancient plumbing, a brick wall lined with soot stains where the old ovens once stood. To anyone else, it was a relic. To them, it was potential. Evelyn ran her fingers along the wall and said, "This will be the meeting room." Caleb pointed toward the rear and replied, "And that, right there, that'll be your dream library wall." They got to work before the ink on the lease had dried. Every night after finishing up at client sites, they'd come to the new space and stay past midnight. They ripped out counters, patched drywall, and painted the walls a cool ivory. Caleb built a new front desk by hand. Evelyn spent a whole weekend selecting curtain rods and door handles that felt like warmth. The renovation cost more than they'd budgeted, but neither of them blinked. This was what they had waited for. They named it Blake plus Morgan Design Studio. Their first official project came from a friend of a friend, a retired teacher who wanted her outdated bungalow remodeled into something accessible, cheerful, and full of life. Evelyn poured her heart into every corner, from the sunrise-colored backsplash in the kitchen to the cozy reading nook under the window. Caleb reworked the layout to make everything wheelchair-friendly, even going as far as adjusting the lighting angles for her aging eyes. When the client walked in and burst into tears, Evelyn cried with her. Word spread fast. By the end of the year, they were booked solid for 6 months. With the growth came longer hours and less sleep. Evelyn thrived under pressure. She kept detailed spreadsheets, managed clients, directed contractors, and still found time to write handwritten thank you notes after every project. Caleb took on more structural work, often staying behind on job sites to triple-check every measurement. He'd come home late, sawdust in his hair, and Evelyn would greet him with a tired smile and 2 mugs of chamomile tea. Their life was simple but full, except for the one empty space neither of them mentioned anymore. The idea of children had become a ghost that hovered in their home, sometimes silent, sometimes suffocating. Evelyn still glanced longingly at strollers in the park. She still added baby rooms to floor plans without being asked. Caleb noticed, of course, but he never brought it up, and Evelyn was too afraid that if she did, it might break the fragile harmony they had fought so hard to build. So she buried it. Instead, she threw herself deeper into their projects. She redecorated their apartment's hallway, started a new social media campaign, and even hired a part-time intern, an eager 20-year-old named Jenna, who reminded her painfully of the version of herself that had once believed everything was still ahead. One Friday evening, Evelyn came home exhausted, her body aching from a full day of site visits. She opened the fridge to find nothing but half a lemon and a bottle of hot sauce. She sighed and grabbed her phone, but before she could dial, the door opened. Caleb stood there, drenched from the rain, holding 2 brown bags and grinning like a fool. "I got tacos," he said, "and flan." She laughed and reached for a towel. "You're soaked." "And starving," he replied. "Can we eat in bed like heathens?" "Only if we promise not to spill salsa on the sheets again." They curled up under the comforter, eating with their fingers, laughing over spicy bites and crumbs. For a moment, Evelyn forgot everything else. The deadlines, the tests, the silence between them. Later that night, when the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, Caleb lay beside her in the dark and whispered, "You still want kids, don't you?" Evelyn turned her head slowly. "Yes. I'm sorry I've been distant." She held her breath. "It's not that I don't want it," he continued. "I'm just scared." "Of what?" "Of failing you. Of giving you hope and not being able to make it real." Her throat tightened. "But we're in this together, Caleb. We always have been." He nodded. "I know." For the first time in months, Evelyn felt the pressure between them shift, like a door creaking open. They agreed to see a specialist. Together. 2 weeks later, they sat in a small, pastel-colored office, holding hands as the doctor reviewed their tests. Evelyn's results were still normal. Caleb's were, too. Their compatibility was excellent, the doctor said, smiling. Sometimes, she explained, these things just take time, patience, and maybe a little faith. Evelyn left the clinic feeling lighter, hopeful. Caleb, not so much. That same night, as they brushed their teeth side by side, Evelyn looked at him through the mirror. "Do you believe her?" she asked. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I believe in you." It was a beautiful thing to say, and yet Evelyn could feel something deeper stirring inside her. An urgency, a shadow. She was tired of waiting. That weekend, Caleb suggested they get away for her birthday, just the two of them. A cabin in the mountains, a fire pit, no Wi-Fi. Evelyn hesitated. There was too much work, too many deadlines. But he insisted. "You need a break," he said. "We both do." So she agreed. They never made it, because the accident happened the day before they were supposed to leave on a street she had driven 100 times before. In a moment, she would replay in her mind, again and again, until the memory fractured into something unbearable. The rain had started as a mist, soft, almost forgettable. Evelyn had left the office early that day, determined to pick up the burgundy dress she'd pre-ordered from a boutique downtown. Caleb had offered to come with her, but he was still finishing up a site visit across town. "I'll meet you at home," he had said. "We'll order takeout. Celebrate early." She had smiled. "Don't be late." Those were the last words they exchanged before everything shattered. She remembered the warm air inside the boutique, the pleasant weight of the new dress in its garment bag, the smell of citrusy perfume clinging to the clerk's sleeves. She had walked out, still humming a half-finished tune from the radio, when the streetlights flickered to green. What came next was colorless, a blur of headlights, a scream that wasn't hers, the sickening crunch of metal folding in on itself. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she was upside down. Everything was quiet except for the high-pitched whine inside her ears. Her hands reached out, grasping for air, for shape, for something that made sense. The dress was still in the passenger seat, crushed under the dashboard. A thin trail of blood slid from her hairline across her cheek. Then darkness. When she woke again, the room smelled sterile and far away. Her mouth was dry. Her body wouldn't move. Panic gripped her chest like a vice, but when she tried to scream, all that came out was a thin gasp. A nurse appeared in her peripheral vision and called someone. Moments later, Caleb rushed into the room, his face ghostly pale, eyes rimmed red with sleep and fear. "Evelyn," he breathed. "Oh my God, you're awake." She wanted to speak, to ask where she was, what had happened, what was broken, but the words wouldn't come. Caleb held her hand. His was shaking. "You were in an accident. A driver ran a red light. You spun out." She tried to sit up. Don't, he said quickly. Don't move. The doctors need to explain it to you. That was the moment Evelyn understood something was very wrong. The neurologist arrived shortly after. His expression professional, practiced. You suffered a spinal contusion. There's significant trauma to the lower vertebrae. You were unconscious for 36 hours. The good news is you're alive. The bad news is, he hesitated, choosing his words. You may experience limited mobility, possibly long-term. We need further imaging to determine the extent. She blinked. Are you saying I might not walk again? There's still inflammation. We can't say anything with certainty yet. But certainty wasn't necessary. The dread blooming inside her was loud enough. Caleb stayed by her side through the first week. He fed her, brushed her hair, held her hand through the MRIs. He tried to make her laugh, showing her silly memes and recounting disastrous client stories. She smiled for him sometimes, but inside, she felt like something inside her was rotting. The second week, the truth arrived in full. She couldn't move her legs, not even slightly, not a twitch, not a tremble. I can't feel anything, she whispered one night, staring at her feet. They don't even feel like mine. Caleb knelt beside her. That can change. The doctor said, no, she interrupted, her voice hollow. They said it might. They never said it would. He reached for her, but she turned her head away. The physical pain was brutal, but it was nothing compared to what was building inside her. The slow, crushing realization that her body had betrayed her. Her dreams had betrayed her. All those nursery sketches, all the names she'd doodled in notebooks. The vision of holding a child in her arms. How could she raise a child like this? How could she even be a wife? The days dragged on. Physical therapy began, but progress was negligible. Evelyn was patient, then frustrated, then furious. She pushed herself harder than the doctors advised. She demanded answers they couldn't give. She broke down during a routine stretch and sobbed until the therapist left the room. One morning, she looked at Caleb and said quietly, maybe you should leave. He froze. What? You didn't sign up for this. He dropped his coffee. It splashed across the tile, but neither of them flinched. I'm serious, she said. I don't want to trap you in this. He walked to her bedside slowly, knelt again, and took her hand. You are not a trap, he said. You are the only thing in my life that has ever made sense. Her lip trembled, but she didn't reply, because deep down, some part of her still didn't believe it. After a month, they discharged her from the hospital. Caleb had modified their apartment with ramps and a wider shower. Ruth, the woman who had been cleaning for them on occasion, was now present every day, helping with everything Evelyn couldn't do on her own. Evelyn hated the sound of her own wheelchair. She hated needing help to get dressed. She hated the hollow clunk of her crutches against hardwood. But most of all, she hated that Caleb still looked at her with hope, because she didn't feel like the woman he'd proposed to anymore. She felt like a shadow of someone who used to build houses, who used to draw nurseries, who used to believe the future was made of more than broken bones and hollow apologies. One afternoon, she looked at herself in the mirror, sitting in the chair, hair flat, eyes dull, and whispered, You're not a mother. You're not even a woman anymore. And she believed it, at least until someone unexpected rang the doorbell. A stranger who claimed to know her name. A man with gray in his beard and regret in his voice. A man who said softly, Is Evelyn Blake home? And Ruth, frowning, skeptical but curious, let him in, because that man was her father. The knock was soft, almost hesitant, like whoever stood on the porch was debating whether to flee. Ruth wiped her hands on a dish towel, her brow furrowed. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, and they weren't expecting anyone. Evelyn was in the bedroom, curled in the same chair she rarely left now, staring blankly at the window like she was watching a world she no longer belonged to. When Ruth opened the door, she found a man, late 50s, maybe 60. His hair was more silver than dark, his posture straight but tired. There was something familiar in his face, though she couldn't place it. His eyes were warm but cautious. In his hand, he clutched a worn leather messenger bag, the kind doctors carried in old films. "Can I help you?" Ruth asked, stepping slightly in front of the doorway. "I'm looking for Evelyn Blake," the man said. His voice was quiet, deliberate. "I was told she lives here." Ruth's body stiffened. She didn't like the way that sounded, like some lawyer trying to dig up a past Evelyn had spent her whole life trying to bury. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Blake." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "You have the same last name." "I know." A pause. Then, "I'm her father." Silence. The words dropped like lead on the doorstep. Ruth stared at him, unable to speak. "I know how that sounds," he added quickly. "And I don't expect you to believe me. But please just let me explain. I won't stay long. I've waited nearly 30 years to speak to her. I can wait a few more minutes, if I have to." Ruth hesitated. There was something in his voice. Not pleading. Not guilt. Something closer to ache. She stepped aside. "Come in. But keep your voice down. She's not well." Thomas removed his shoes at the door. He moved with the quiet awareness of someone used to hospitals, of someone who had spent years entering rooms where people were too broken to speak. They sat in the kitchen. Ruth made coffee, more out of habit than hospitality. "She doesn't know you," Ruth said flatly. "I know. She's been through hell." "I've been told." "What exactly do you want from her?" Thomas exhaled and looked down at his hands. "I want to give her something I never had the courage to offer, the truth." And so he told Ruth everything. He had met Evelyn's mother, Karen, in college. She had been fiery, ambitious, beautiful. He had been poor, awkward, but hopelessly in love. For a while it had worked. They'd planned a life together. But then came the rejection letters, the mounting debt, the moments where love wasn't enough to cover rent. Karen had grown tired. She wanted comfort, success, a partner who could offer her the kind of security Thomas simply didn't have. One night, she left without warning. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Months later, Thomas had learned, through a friend of a friend, that she'd married someone else. It gutted him. He buried himself in work, took a fellowship overseas, and didn't look back. He became a doctor, a respected rehabilitative specialist, built a career helping people learn to walk again. But he never stopped thinking about her, and he never knew about Evelyn. Not until 2 months ago. Karen, dying of cancer, had found his sister, Thomas's only family left in their hometown. Through tears, she had confessed the truth, that she'd been pregnant when she left him, that she'd given birth to a girl, that her name was Evelyn, that she had put the child into care when things with her new husband grew difficult, and had never looked back. "She begged my sister to find me," Thomas said, his voice breaking for the first time. "She wanted me to make it right, but I don't know if I can. I just want the chance to try." Ruth stared at him for a long time. She had seen men lie before, seen them charm, manipulate, dodge. But this man wasn't lying. He was trembling. He looked like someone who had come home to a house that no longer existed. "She's been told she might never walk again," Ruth finally said. "She's been through surgeries, painkillers, nightmares, and now you show up with a story and the same last name? What exactly are you offering her?" Thomas reached slowly into his bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were credentials, certifications, letters of recommendation from medical institutions across Europe and the US. "I'm not just here as her father," he said. "I'm here as someone who might be able to help." Ruth's jaw tightened. "I've worked with spinal injuries for 25 years. I've seen cases where hope was a whisper and recovery seemed impossible. And still, some of those people walk again. Not all, but some. And you think Evelyn is one of them?" "I think I won't know until I try. And I think she deserves more than what she's been given." For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then, From the hallway, a faint voice called out, "Ruth? Is everything okay?" Ruth turned toward the bedroom door. Her heart thudded. She looked at Thomas, then back again. There was no preparing Evelyn for this. But maybe, just maybe, she's not strong enough for surprises, Ruth said carefully. But she's too smart for lies. I'll tell her someone's here to evaluate her condition. She doesn't need to know who you are. Not yet. Thomas nodded, tears shining in his eyes. Thank you. Ruth stood. Don't thank me yet. And with that, she walked slowly down the hall, her palms sweating, her heart bracing itself for the moment Evelyn would unknowingly come face to face with the man who had never been there. Until now. Evelyn was sitting by the window, sketchbook in lap, pencil unmoving. She wasn't drawing anything, just staring out, watching raindrops trace tiny rivers down the glass. Ruth stepped inside quietly, her voice soft but steady. "Hey," she said. "There's someone here from Boulder General. Says he specializes in spinal rehab. I figured maybe it wouldn't hurt to get a second opinion." Evelyn didn't look up. "Another one?" "This one came recommended by someone I trust." A long silence. Then Evelyn set the pencil down. "Fine, but I'm not smiling through another pep talk." Ruth gave a tight nod and left before Evelyn could see the tremble in her hands. In the living room, Thomas stood waiting. He had changed into a clean shirt, tucked in neatly, the kind that said he was a professional first. But when Evelyn entered, wheeled slowly in by Ruth, he forgot everything he had prepared to say. Because there she was, his daughter, grown, beautiful in a way that broke him, like porcelain glued back together with veins of gold. Her face carried her mother's angles, but none of her chill. Her hair was tied in a loose knot, and though her eyes were tired, they burned with quiet defiance. She glanced at him, skeptical. "So, you're the miracle worker." Thomas smiled, but it barely reached his eyes. "Just someone who's seen a lot of impossible things become possible." She nodded once. "Let's get this over with." They spoke clinically at first. She described the injury. He asked about her range of motion, her medication, the latest MRI. She challenged his questions like a student testing a professor. He took it all in stride. When she refused to let him examine her legs directly, he said, "No problem. We'll go at your pace." Ruth stayed in the corner, pretending to check emails, but she watched everything. How Evelyn's body stiffened each time he leaned closer. How Thomas's fingers trembled slightly when he reached for his pen. He never once let his voice crack, never once called her by name. When the session ended, Evelyn said, "Thanks, I guess. You were less annoying than the last guy." Thomas smiled again, but this time it held something softer. "You're stronger than most of the people I've treated." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You say that to all your patients." "No," he said quietly. "Only the ones who remind me of someone I lost." She didn't ask what he meant. She just wheeled herself out of the room. That night, after dinner, Ruth found Evelyn staring at her reflection in the mirror. "He's good," Evelyn muttered. "Too good. Like he knew the answers before I finished the questions." "Because he's one of the best," Ruth said carefully. Evelyn turned to her. "You've seen him before?" "No," Ruth swallowed. "But he wasn't lying." "About what?" Ruth hesitated. "About wanting to help. About being here for you. And maybe about more than that." Evelyn's face hardened. "What are you saying?" Ruth stepped closer, lowered her voice. "I didn't tell you everything. His name is Thomas Blake." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Evelyn's jaw clenched. "You're kidding. He didn't ask me to lie. He didn't push. He just wanted to help. I thought you deserved to hear it from someone you trust." Evelyn closed her eyes. The name tasted like rust in her mouth. "I don't trust anyone who shows up after 30 years and expects to be something," she whispered. "You don't have to," Ruth said gently. "But maybe you don't have to slam the door either." Evelyn didn't respond. Because inside her chest, something ancient and aching had begun to stir. A voice she'd buried so long ago she forgot it was hers. She slept badly that night. Dreams came jagged and fast. Memories of foster homes, of hospital beds, of drawing floor plans alone in a notebook. When she woke, her face was damp. Not from sweat, from tears. The next morning, she rolled into the living room to find Thomas already there, sipping coffee. He looked up, surprised. Evelyn didn't say good morning. She just sat across from him and said, "You're not here to fix me." He set the mug down. "No, you're here to make up for something." He nodded. "Yes. That doesn't mean I forgive you. I wouldn't expect you to." Another silence, this one gentler. Then she said, "But if you're going to be part of my recovery, you don't get to treat me like a patient." Thomas blinked. "What do I treat you like?" She held his gaze, like a person, like a daughter, like someone who gets to decide if you're allowed back in. He nodded again, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something shift in his eyes, not guilt, not grief, just hope, thin, fragile, but real. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Thomas returned each morning at 9, carrying 2 cups of black coffee, one sweetened with honey, the way Ruth had told him Evelyn liked it. He never arrived early, never stayed late. He didn't hover or pry. Instead, he let the work guide them. And slowly, Evelyn stopped flinching at his presence. They began with passive stretches, gentle movements meant to remind Evelyn's body of pathways it had forgotten. Her muscles resisted at first, tight, stiff, foreign. But Thomas never pushed. "Pain is not progress," he said softly. "It's the body's way of asking for patience." She hated how calm he was, and how familiar that calm felt. There were days she wanted to scream. Days when her legs might as well have been blocks of cement, when frustration chewed at her like acid. One morning, she threw a resistance band across the room and snapped. "Maybe this is who I am now. Maybe you're wasting your time." Thomas bent down, picked up the band, and placed it gently back beside her. "Then let's waste it together." She didn't say anything after that, but she didn't stop either. By the 3rd week, she could twitch her right toe. It was so faint, so quick, that Ruth thought it was a spasm. But Evelyn knew, and Thomas saw it too. "You're not done," he said quietly. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She lay awake in the dark, eyes fixed on the ceiling, her heart pounding with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that grows from truth. She still couldn't stand on her own, but the silence inside her body had finally been broken. Caleb noticed the change first. She laughed more, asked about design projects, asked about him. One afternoon, she reviewed an entire client proposal from her laptop, her voice sharp, confident, alive. "You're coming back," he whispered as they lay in bed that night. Evelyn looked at him and said no. "I'm becoming something new." Still, she couldn't quite bring herself to ask Thomas the questions that kept burning in her mind. Why now? Why didn't you fight for me? Where were you when I needed you the most? Instead, she kept things professional, conversations about vertebrae, nerve regeneration, PT protocols. She told herself she didn't want to know, that the version of her who'd once longed for a father had died somewhere between the foster homes and the accident. But then came the photo. It was buried deep inside Thomas's notebook, slipped between notes and charts. She wasn't snooping. The notebook had fallen off the table during a session, and as she reached to pick it up, a black and white picture slid out. She stared at it, a baby girl, no older than 1, wrapped in a knitted blanket, her face round, her hair a tuft of chaos, her eyes huge and unmistakably hers. Evelyn looked up. Thomas had frozen. "Is this me?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "My sister gave it to me." "When?" "2 months ago. After your mother, after Karen passed." Evelyn's voice was hollow. "So you knew I existed for what?" 60 days. He looked away. No, I found out you existed 15 years ago. The room went still. What? She called me once. Just once. From a blocked number. Told me your name. Said you were better off without me. That I'd only ruin things if I came back. And I listened. Evelyn's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair. You listened. I was a coward, he admitted. I told myself it was too late. That she was right. That I had nothing to offer but guilt and medicine and 30 years of absence. Tears welled in her eyes, not because of the betrayal, but because part of her still wanted to believe him, still wanted to believe anything that could make sense of the aching silence that had followed her all her life. I grew up thinking no one wanted me, she whispered. I did, he said. I just didn't know how to want you the right way. Evelyn rolled backward, away from him, the photo still in her hand. You don't get to show up with coffee and miracle stretches and fix what you left broken. I know, Thomas said quietly, but I'll show up anyway. She didn't reply. She wheeled herself to her room and closed the door. But she didn't tear up the photo. She didn't throw it away. Instead, she placed it beside her bed and stared at it until her vision blurred. Because for the first time in her life, she had proof, irrefutable, undeniable, that someone had once held her like she mattered, even if it hadn't lasted, even if it had come too late. That night, she dreamed of footsteps. Not hers. His. The next morning, Evelyn didn't mention the photo. She didn't bring up the conversation. She didn't look at Thomas for longer than a second when he entered. But she didn't ask him to leave either. And that, for her, was something. The session that day was slower, quieter. Her body was fatigued. Her spirit more so. But she allowed him to guide her arms, adjust her posture, help her through movements that still felt foreign. When his hand brushed hers, she didn't flinch. When his voice softened in encouragement, she didn't roll her eyes. He knew she was listening, even in silence. Around noon, Caleb came home for lunch. He greeted Thomas with a polite nod, then walked over to Evelyn and kissed the top of her head. How's my favorite fighter? Evelyn smirked faintly. Sore, hungry, tired of being a science experiment. You look stronger. She shrugged, but something in her posture straightened. Caleb sat beside her as Thomas packed up his notes and quietly excused himself. I'll come by tomorrow. We can try balance board work. When the door closed, Caleb turned to her. You okay? Evelyn didn't respond right away. Then she whispered he had a photo of me. As a baby. Caleb's eyes widened. He showed you. No. It fell out of his notebook. I think he carries it. Caleb took her hand. Do you want to talk about it? She shook her head. Not yet. But she thought about it. All day. Even as she reviewed a client's blueprint. Even as Ruth read aloud an article about adaptive housing models. Even as she sat in the tub, watching water trace scars she had memorized. The image of that photo, the tiny version of herself, wide-eyed and unaware of the path ahead, wouldn't leave her mind. That night, as she lay awake, Evelyn whispered, what kind of man holds onto a picture of a child he never raised? Caleb stirred beside her, maybe one who regrets it every day. Evelyn didn't reply, but she didn't sleep either. The following week brought progress, physical and otherwise. With Thomas's help, she began standing between parallel bars, her legs trembling beneath her like they weren't sure what to believe. The first time she managed to support her weight for 3 full seconds, Ruth burst into tears and dropped her phone. Evelyn just stared down at her feet and whispered, Okay, I'm still here. Afterward, Thomas offered her a hand, but she waved him off. Let me fall on my own if I need to. He nodded. You won't. She didn't smile, but she didn't argue either. One afternoon, as they sat cooling down, Evelyn asked suddenly, Did you ever want other kids? Thomas was startled. No, why not? He took a moment, then said, Because I already had one, and I didn't deserve another chance. Evelyn stared at the floor. I used to imagine you were some soldier, or a missionary, somewhere far away doing good, saving lives, that you couldn't come back, not that you didn't want to. Thomas's voice broke. I wish that were true. You could have fought. I should have. Silence fell again. Then Evelyn said, almost too softly, "But you're fighting now." And Thomas, who had waited 30 years for this moment, nodded, blinking back tears. "With everything I have left." Later that evening, Ruth found Evelyn in the kitchen, adjusting her chair height on her own. "You're pushing hard today," she noted. Evelyn didn't look up. "I want to walk into the next room without needing anyone." Why the sudden fire? I don't want him to be the only one proving something. The next day, Thomas arrived with something different in his bag, a folded piece of paper. After their exercises, he set it on the table. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. He hesitated. "It's the address to a place in Denver, a rehabilitation center I helped design. I still consult there. They've got equipment I can't bring here. Robotics, immersive balance systems, things I think could help." Evelyn frowned. "You want me to go to a hospital?" "I want you to see what's possible." She picked up the paper, studied it, then quietly asked, "Would you go with me?" His breath caught. Then he nodded. "If you'll have me." Her eyes didn't meet his, but she didn't hand the paper back. And when he left that afternoon, he found himself smiling for the first time in years. Not because he had been forgiven, but because she had asked him to stay. They left for Denver 3 days later. Evelyn insisted on packing her own bag, even though her hands trembled slightly from fatigue. Caleb offered to come, but she shook her head. "This one's mine," she said, quiet but firm. "If I walk again, I want it to be because I decided to." Thomas met her at the curb in a rented van equipped for wheelchairs. He didn't speak much during the drive. Just turn the music low, jazz, something smooth and wordless, and let the road unfold in silence. Evelyn watched the mountains rise and stretch into the sky. She didn't say it out loud, but a small part of her felt like she was leaving something behind. And maybe that was okay. The rehabilitation center was nothing like the hospital she'd known. It smelled like pine wood and lavender oil. Natural light poured in through glass panels. Murals lined the hallways, portraits of patients in motion, running, laughing, swimming. A nurse named Alana greeted her by name. "Dr. Blake told us a lot about you," she said, smiling. "But you're even more impressive in person." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "I'm just another file." "No," Alana said gently. "You're someone who keeps showing up. That's never just." Over the next week, Evelyn was immersed in a world that demanded everything she had and gave something back. Balance work with harness support, neuromuscular re-education, mirror therapy, pain, sweat, doubt, and flickers of strength in places she thought were dead. Thomas observed closely but never hovered. He offered adjustments only when asked, notes only when welcomed. When she fell, he was silent until she reached for his hand. When she succeeded, he didn't cheer. He just looked her in the eye and said, "Again." And she did, again, and again. On the 9th day, Evelyn stood between two bars, holding herself upright for 13 full seconds. "No tremble, no spate, no apology," Alana whispered to Thomas. "We have to record this." He shook his head. "Not yet. It's not her moment until she decides it is." That evening, Evelyn sat on the patio outside her suite, watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline. Thomas joined her, handing her a cup of warm tea. "You don't talk much when I fall," she said. "I've seen enough people fall to know the ones who get up don't need speeches." She sipped her tea. "My whole life, I thought healing meant going back to who I was before. But now, I don't even want that girl back. She was tired. She was so angry all the time." Thomas looked at her. "And now?" Now I'm not angry, she said, then added, not just angry. He hesitated. I wasn't ready to be a father back then. I know, she said, but you still were one, whether you ran or not. A long silence. Then Evelyn turned to him. Do you regret it? Every day. She nodded slowly. That doesn't fix it. I know, but it matters. They didn't say anything for a while. Then, Evelyn asked quietly, what did you think when you saw me again the first time? Thomas smiled softly. I thought the world was cruel for keeping you from me, but kind for letting me see you now. She blinked quickly, her throat tight. Sometimes I wish I hadn't wanted to know you. It would have been easier. He nodded. I know. She looked away, but I'm glad I did. The next morning, Evelyn asked to try the treadmill, an anti-gravity model with full body support. It looked like something from the future, all harnesses and suspension bands and touchscreens. She let Alana strap her in, ignoring the knot in her stomach. I want him in the room, she said, pointing to Thomas. Of course, Alana said. Thomas stood silently by the window. The machine whirred to life. Evelyn's feet hit the belt. Once. Then again. Small steps. Shaky steps. But real. Everyone in the room held their breath. After 30 seconds, Evelyn looked up, met Thomas's eyes, and whispered, Don't you dare cry. He didn't. But Ruth would later say he was quiet for a long, long time that night. Because in that room, Evelyn hadn't just moved her legs. She had taken her first step toward forgiving the man who once walked away from her, and now walked beside her. 3 weeks into rehab, Evelyn no longer measured time in days or pain levels. She measured it in inches, in balance seconds, in the way her fingers no longer trembled when she reached for a glass of water, in how Ruth no longer hovered in doorways, worried she'd fall apart. She still used the chair, but less. Each movement now held something more than determination. It held ownership. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Thomas brought her a packet of old medical reports. I thought you should see this, he said, setting the folder on her tray. It's from your early therapy years, from the group home clinic. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Where'd you get this? I called in a favor from a colleague who still has access to archived county health records. I wasn't trying to dig. I just wanted to understand. She flipped through the faded forms, scribbled evaluations, therapy notes, missed appointments. Her name printed in shaky penmanship. Her progress charts plateaued around age 8. Then one line, almost buried in a corner of a page, caught her eye. Patient has significant response to external male voice tones. Shows signs of confusion/withdrawal when male caregivers leave. Evelyn stopped reading. That line, it felt like a hand reaching through time, clutching her chest. She closed the folder. I don't want to be a study anymore. Thomas nodded. You're not. But that night, the words haunted her. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering how she'd used to follow male staff members around the shelter, teachers, nurses, volunteers. How her heart would sink when they left at the end of the day. She'd chalked it up to being lonely, desperate for attention. She never realized she'd been searching for someone she never got, until now. The following morning, she told Thomas, no more records, no more paperwork. If you want to know me, ask. He agreed. So he did. What was your favorite book as a kid? She grinned. The Giver, because it was quiet and powerful, like the parts of me no one understood. First crush. My 5th grade art teacher. He had paint on his shoes and never judged anyone's work. They played this game for hours, questions that meant nothing and everything. Questions that rebuilt something between them, not like it had ever been whole, but like it could be made new. Eventually, Evelyn asked, Did you love my mother? Thomas looked away. I did, but not enough to stay when it got hard. She didn't push further, because she understood Some love doesn't die. It just loses its shape. On the last week of her stay, Evelyn stood fully without support for almost 2 minutes. Ruth recorded it. Caleb drove down for the weekend and cried in the parking lot before composing himself and walking in with a smile. Evelyn pretended not to notice his red eyes, but later she whispered, "You were always the soft one." He laughed. "That's why I fell for you. You're all sharp edges and fire, and I wanted to be the calm." On the final day, as they prepared to return home, Thomas knocked on her sweet door. In his hand was a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper. "I know we don't do the whole gift thing," he said, "but this isn't a gift. It's something I kept when I shouldn't have." Inside was a music box. Simple, wooden, hand-carved. When she opened it, a lullaby played, faint, wobbly notes. The tune hit something raw in her chest. "I bought it the day your mother told me she was pregnant," he said. "I was going to give it to you when you were born." Evelyn blinked, then closed the lid gently. "I don't need it." He nodded, "But I'm glad you brought it." The van ride home was different from the one they'd taken weeks before. This time she talked. About books. About design clients. About how she was thinking of writing again. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, like someone who finally understood how much he had missed. As they pulled into her driveway, Ruth was waiting with balloons and an absurdly large "Welcome back" champ sign. Evelyn rolled her eyes but smiled. Thomas helped her unload the bag, then turned to leave. Evelyn stopped him. "You're not done yet." He looked at her. She gestured to the house. "There are 3 steps up to that door. You're helping me climb them." Together they took it slow. 1 step, then another. When she reached the top, she didn't look back. She just whispered, "You're allowed to come inside this time." And for Thomas Blake, who had spent most of his life walking away, that was more than enough. Life settled into something resembling peace. Evelyn continued her therapy at a local clinic while working part-time remotely with Caleb's architecture firm. Ruth visited almost every day, bringing fresh soup, gossip from the rehab center, and a kind of maternal presence Evelyn never thought she'd come to rely on. Thomas didn't come over often. He didn't need to. His presence had shifted from outsider to orbit. He no longer hovered, but he never drifted far either. One Thursday morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name, written in a rushed, familiar script. It was from Karen, her mother. Evelyn stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent, the handwriting jagged. There were coffee stains along the edges and one smudge that looked suspiciously like a tear. It wasn't long, barely a page, but it hit like a car crash. "Evelyn, you'll never understand why I did what I did. And maybe you shouldn't. Maybe this is just a selfish woman trying to make peace with something unforgivable. I lied to you about him. I told you he didn't want you, that he was gone. I told you he left us. But the truth is, I told him to stay away. He called once a few years after. I never let him speak to you. I told him you hated him. I told him not to ruin your life by showing up. I did it out of anger and fear and maybe some jealousy. I couldn't stand the thought of you loving someone more than me. By the time I wanted to take it back, it was too late. And now, I think it's always been too late. But if you're reading this, it means I finally let someone else put it in the mail. I'm sorry." Karen Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just folded the letter in half and walked outside, barefoot, into the garden Ruth had helped her plant. She sat on the bench by the rosemary bush and stared at nothing. Thomas found her an hour later. She didn't say a word, just handed him the letter. When he finished reading, he folded it back with trembling hands and said, "She was wrong about one thing." Evelyn looked up. "It wasn't too late," he said. "Not for everything." She nodded and said nothing more. But that night, she dug through the box of old photos Ruth had saved from the group home. She laid them out on her bedroom floor, arranging them by year. Tiny Evelyn in braided pigtails holding paintbrushes, hugging battered teddy bears. No parents in the photos, just her. She sat there for hours. Then she picked up one of the earliest pictures, a black and white snapshot of herself as a toddler, laughing with a crumpled paper crown on her head, and placed it beside the music box, a quiet offering, not to forget, but to begin again, from what remained. The next morning, she made a decision. I want to go back, she told Ruth and Thomas at breakfast, to the rehab center, not for treatment, for design. They both blinked. You want to? Thomas began. Redesign the recovery wing, she said. It's cold. It feels like a clinic. But healing isn't clinical. It's emotional. I want to create a space where people feel like they're recovering their lives, not just their limbs. Thomas smiled slowly. That's the most you thing I've ever heard. She pointed a fork at him. Don't go soft on me now. I wouldn't dare. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn poured herself into the project. She met with directors, walked the halls again, this time upright, on her own, slowly but surely. She interviewed patients, took notes on what comfort meant to people who'd lost everything. She didn't realize it yet, but this was the final part of her healing. Not the standing, not the walking, but the reclaiming of her voice, her story, her future. Because for someone who had spent so long being defined by absence, she had finally chosen presence. And every step forward from there was not a return to who she had been, but a declaration of who she had become. The reopening of the rehabilitation wing was scheduled for a crisp Sunday morning in late October. The leaves outside were turning gold, crimson, rust, and Evelyn stood at the entrance of the new wing with a clipboard in one hand and a scarf draped around her shoulders, not to keep warm, but because it matched the new lobby tones. She designed every inch of the space, from the curved oak reception desk to the soft mustard cushions in the waiting area. There were no harsh lights, no sterile white, just warm textures, quiet corners, and framed drawings from former patients lining the walls. She didn't walk in with a dramatic flourish. She rolled in calmly, surveying each detail like an architect, not a patient. Her body was stronger now, still relying on assistance sometimes, still building endurance, but her posture was different. There was no shame in how she moved anymore. Thomas arrived a little late, holding a small potted lavender plant. They told me you hated flowers that die fast. She smiled. Ido. You look, he paused. At home. I am. They walked the hall together. The patients were just starting to arrive, some in chairs, some with walkers, some barely standing. But all of them moved differently when they entered the space. Their eyes lifted. Their shoulders dropped. A mother with a child recovering from spinal surgery began to cry when she saw the soft reading nook Evelyn had carved into the corner, stocked with picture books and pillows. It's not a hospital anymore, Thomas whispered. It's a sanctuary. Evelyn didn't respond, but her eyes were glassy. At the far end of the hall stood a sculpture. It hadn't been there before. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What's that? Commissioned it, she said, from a local metalworker. It was abstract, a series of rising lines, each one welded slightly imperfectly, then curving upward in a wave. The plaque beneath it read, "Nothing broken stays, silent forever." He stared at it for a long moment. That for you. It's for anyone who got up when no one saw them fall. Later, as guests trickled out and the space settled into quiet again, Thomas lingered by the large windows overlooking the hills. Evelyn joined him. Neither spoke for a while. Then she said softly, I hated you for a long time. I know. And I might hate parts of you forever. He nodded. But today, when I saw that boy in the yellow wheelchair look at the books I picked out, and when his mother smiled for the first time since walking in, she paused. I didn't think about you at all. He looked at her. That's good. She turned. It means I'm not trapped in your shadow anymore. I never wanted you to be. She gave a faint smile. You didn't have to want it. You just weren't there to block the sun. They stood together, side by side. I'm not offering you a second chance, she said. I wouldn't ask. But if you want to stay in my life, you'll have to build something. With you. No, she said, eyes narrowing. Beside me. He let out a breath, half laugh, half sob. That's more than I deserve. Exactly. Before he could reply, a small girl from the new pediatric unit ran past them, dragging a stuffed elephant behind her. She waved at Evelyn, then tripped slightly. Evelyn's hand shot out instinctively, steadying her with surprising speed. Whoa, the girl whispered. You're really fast. Evelyn grinned, getting faster every day. Thomas watched her as the girl ran off again. You ever think about having one of those? Evelyn turned. A stuffed elephant. He laughed. A kid. She considered the question, then said, maybe, one day, if I meet someone who doesn't flinch at scars or stubbornness. I know someone like that. Too late, she said, teasing gently. He's already busy trying to fix what he broke. They walked outside together into the amber light. The air was cold but not bitter, and for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Blake didn't feel like she was recovering from something. She felt like she was beginning something, not with a bang, but with a quiet promise. This life was hers now, and no one, no absence, no lie, no man, would ever take it from her again.